UN climate talks have resumed in Copenhagen after grinding to a halt on Monday. Developing countries are insisting that developed nations discuss deeper cuts to their greenhouse emissions caps. Damien Jones reports.
Developing countries say the Copenhagen conference is likely to kill the Kyoto Protocol. Many accuse developed nations of dodging their responsibilities by trying to put an end to the 1997 agreement. Developed countries have been asked not to shirk their climate change obligations and to provide unconditional funding and technological support. But a number of richer nations think the emissions cut limits are too strict. The dispute comes as the discussions enter their second week and just days before more than 100 world leaders are scheduled to arrive in the Danish capital.
I think that basically the first week went all right. It's always difficult the first week, but basically I think that people have come down to work, and that's what we're trying to continue today with the way we'll structure the work today. And I just consulted the G77, so I cannot go into details now, but that will come later today. So I think everybody knows that the deadline is getting very, very short, and they have to get it done.
The senior climate change policy advisor for Oxfam says that developing countries are being unfairly accused of sabotaging the talks.
Well, in this tit for tat, there's accusations that developing countries, the poorest countries, the ones that most need urgent action on climate change, are blocking the talks. And I think in respect of that, we need to be clear that they're not putting blockages on the tracks in front of the train. What they're doing is pulling the emergency cord to stop the train before it runs off the cliff at the end of this week.
Meanwhile, United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has appointed Nobel Peace Prize laureate Wangari Maathai as the UN Messenger of Peace on climate change issues. The Secretary General, who is leaving for Copenhagen this week, says that climate change is a leading political and economic issue, and it's time for action to respond to the problem. Damien Jones, CCTV.
African representatives at the UN-led climate change talks have expressed their concern that some developed countries are trying to kill the Kyoto Protocol's two-track negotiation mechanism. UN climate chief Ivo de Boer said voicing their concerns will help lead to a compromise at the two-week meeting. Chair of the African group, Jamouth Kamel, told a press conference that its countries were extremely disappointed that some developed nations are trying to abandon the existing system. He also stressed the importance of the Kyoto Protocol, which expires in 2012. De Boer acknowledged most countries would like to see it extended, and that it's not only Africa's concern. The chief also pointed out protests from African groups and environmental campaigns will push leaders towards compromise for a final agreement. And still in Copenhagen, China says it's willing to let African countries and island nations have priority in receiving funds from the developed nations. It also intends to seek cooperation in aiding and giving support to regions according to its capability. The head of the Chinese delegation at the Copenhagen conference, Xie Jianhua, said that as a developing country, China has no duty for providing funding for emissions cuts. Instead, it should receive funding and technological support from developed nations. Xie Jianhua said the proposal of two drafts at the conference reflected the common but differentiated responsibilities and will help to reach a final agreement. He believes the drafts include the double-track mechanism developing countries are calling for, but heated debate still surrounds targets set for emissions cuts and how developed nations will provide support. Environment ministers from around the world have now gathered at the UN Climate Change Conference, and the most recognized US campaigner on the issue is former US Vice President Al Gore. Gore was expected to view the presentation of a report on melting ice and rising sea levels. The gathering is focused on demands, as we mentioned, by developing countries that developed nations raise their pledges for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Meanwhile, representatives from the developing nations say they refuse to participate in any working groups at the summit until that issue is resolved. And despite the dispute between the developing and developed countries, British Climate Change Secretary Ed Miliband says the Copenhagen conference still presents the best opportunity to reach the best agreement that we can.
We have a global movement on this issue that has meant, in part, that 130 leaders will be coming here, and we have a situation where the world is watching climate change in a way that I don't think it's ever done before, and indeed watching events at Copenhagen. That's why we have to go all out to get the best agreement that we can. That's not about getting any agreement, but it's about getting the best agreement that we can, consistent with the science, in the coming days.
And before we leave the subject, preliminary figures on natural disasters in 2009 have been released by the UN in Copenhagen. They show an alarming link to changing weather, with over 90% blamed on extreme conditions. Kimberly Harper reports.
2008.
The figures are shocking. Of the total 245 disasters in 2009, 224 are weather-related. That accounts for over 90%. They caused nearly $15 billion in damages this year, accounting for around 80% of the total cost.
This year, as always, storms and floods were the main killers and the most expensive disasters in dollar terms.
Among the 8,900 people killed by disasters, almost 80% lost their lives to extreme weather. Experts said on Monday nature's fury is unavoidable, but human beings can mitigate the effects.
We cannot prevent natural hazards. You cannot stop a hurricane, you cannot stop heavy rain, you cannot stop drought. But we can make sure that we provide the right information to prevent these extreme events to turn into disasters.
Warming weather will lead to widespread droughts, floods, higher sea levels and worsening storms. A mere 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise could subject up to 2 billion people to water shortages by 2050 and threaten extinction for 20 to 30% of the world's species. The UN Climate Conference in Copenhagen is aimed at addressing the problem. As the meeting enters its critical stage, it's highly anticipated leaders will reach a suitable agreement. Kimberly Harper, CCTV.
And you are with CCTV International. This is News Hour. Coming up, suspicious aims. Iran plans to put 3 Americans on trial while US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton makes a fresh appeal. And largely identical. As the US Special Envoy concludes meetings in Pyongyang, Russian officials admit their position is very similar to the US.